President Bola Tinubu has ordered the reopening of Nigeria's land and air borders with the Republic of Niger, along with the lifting of other sanctions against the country. It is in line with the resolutions of the ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Government during its extraordinary summit last month. ECOWAS leaders collectively agreed to lift economic sanctions against Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso and Guinea during its last meeting here in Abuja. President Tinubu's directive specifically includes lifting the closure of land and air borders, the no-fly zone, suspension of commercial and financial transactions, asset freezes, travel bans on government officials and other restrictions imposed on Niger. Tinubu has also approved lifting financial and economic sanctions against the Republic of Guinea. Presidential Special Advisor Ajuri Ngelale announced the decision would take immediate effect. The lifting of sanctions is expected to facilitate increased economic activities and cooperation between Nigeria and the Republic of Niger, as well as contribute to regional peace and prosperity in West Africa. All right, Rufai, we have seem to have capitulated on our sanctions and now open the borders with Niger Republic. Your thoughts on this story?
At least I'm happy that common sense has prevailed, because when the haphazard decisions were taken at first by President Tinubu, there was no reasoning and thinking for the larger ramifications and the implications of those decisions being taken. And we saw what happened. We saw the protest. We saw how the Senate reneged on those decisions in the first place. What we had told them to do then, that's what they are now trying to do now. And ECOWAS also have learned that this mindset of going to the West as colonial power and the West pushing you, we should be very careful, because in the West, in the end, the West will leave you high and dry. France has moved on, yeah, albeit they still have interest in Niger, but they've been able to recalibrate their ways. But us that we're pushing to go and fight on their behalf, you can see how we've been left high and dry, and now we're licking our wounds. Because all of this didn't happen overnight. It happened because the Nigerian authorities stood firm. We all remember how they deliberately not see, our traditional rulers and the delegation sent by the government, how they finally met with Sanusi Lamido, and the conversations were on, and they too, they had somewhat of a reciprocal action by shutting their airspace to us at a point. So we all saw how all of that pans out. And now they saw that these three African countries, inundated with coups anyway, how they were trying to bolt away and form their own little parts of the sub-region. And I'm happy that wise counsel prevailed by listening to Yakubu Gowon as one of the founding members of ECOWAS. And some of the recommendations he put in that letter, they finally listened to it. I think it's just incumbent going forward. Let's be circumspect in our thinking. Let us think properly before we act, because coming down and relating on the things we have done before speaks volumes about our thinking process as a nation. And also, let us try as much as possible to listen to the voice of reason. Most times it saves us this embarrassment and shame sometimes. But we're happy we are back on with Niger. But this is not an endorsement of the coups that happened in those nations. That we must have a continent that is clean and rid of coups. Secondly, the dialogue must now be as around returning these countries back to democracy. And thirdly, the political actors must stop the environment for their own civilian coups that they perpetrate that lead to military coups.
All right. Dr. Wati?
Okay. The decision that has been taken by the Nigerian government is a follow-up to the decision taken by the ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Government on Saturday, February 24, whereby, the Heads of State decided that sanctions should be lifted on the coup-making countries where the military juntas are taking over, namely Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. And at that time, Ali Touré, Ali Touré, the president of the ECOWAS Commission, said that the lifting of the sanctions will take immediate effect, but that there will still be certain targeted sanctions that will be in place, political and targeted sanctions that will be in place. I took a look at the list of sanctions that have been lifted by Nigeria. What the Nigerian government has done with the authority of President Bola Tinubu is simply to follow the ECOWAS decision of February 24. And that should not be surprising, considering the fact that President Bola Ahmed Tinubu is chairman of ECOWAS. He cannot head an organization that takes a decision and then he will flout it himself. And that would be contradictory. So I think what Tinubu has done in this regard is to show leadership, to follow what they did based on interventions, counsel by the likes of General Yakubu Gowon, one of the founding fathers and the only surviving founding father of ECOWAS. So this is what has happened now. Nigeria has gone a step further by also, in the report by Minister of Information, Mohammed Idris, also lifted sanctions on Guinea. I imagine that other countries, within the ECOWAS region will follow suit. The whole expectation, perhaps, in terms of outcome, will be, as they said on February 24, to defend the interests of the people in these regions, particularly in the spirit of the holy month, to make sure that people are not unnecessarily punished for offenses that have been committed by soldiers. 2, to also open the window of possibility for these three countries, the three countries that have come together to form their own Sahel Defense Group, for them to return to ECOWAS so that there's no division within the region, and to ensure that the crisis in the Sahel is not further complicated because of the exit of these major countries in the Sahel from ECOWAS. However, having given the background, there are questions to be raised. The first questions to be raised has to do with what happens to the democratic reversal process in West Africa. From the 1990s, we started seeing a move towards democratic consolidation, all of these countries becoming, democratic. And now, all of a sudden, you have coups all over the place. And these coups that we have experienced, the coup leaders from Niger to wherever, they remain adamant. As we speak, Bazoum in Niger has not been released, though. He has not been released. The junta is still saying, we are in charge here. So what happens going forward? Would this not show the ineffectuality of ECOWAS? The second question will be about the seeming growing ineffectuality of ECOWAS as a regional body that has its own constitutive acts, that has its own protocols. A major protocol has been breached. The sanctions were enforced. Now the same ECOWAS has said, we are sorry. So it's a humiliation of ECOWAS. So ECOWAS itself is a body that is in need of revival, of reconstruction. That is the second part of it. The third part of it is the fact that, Nigeria now has said, well, we are back with Niger, we're giving them electricity and all of that. These countries, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, minus Guinea, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, they've already linked up very openly with Russia. So there is a geopolitical dimension to it. So is this a triumph also for Russian influence in the Sahel region, in West Africa? And what will be the long-term implications of that? So these are some of the big questions, that are raised. Now tomorrow, the fourth question. Should there be a coup in any other West African country? Would ECOWAS have the guts to even come forward and say, we are imposing sanctions, we are expelling you from ECOWAS? So the bigger issue is about ECOWAS and its integrity, and it has its own internal issues, of course, that has resulted to this situation whereby it is not respected by certain member states. The commission itself needs to be reorganized. The process of recruitment needs to be reorganized. The kind of processes that the ECOWAS Commission engages in on behalf of the ECOWAS Authority of Heads of State and Governments, those processes also have to be reviewed. We hope that with this latest development, beyond Nigeria trying to be a good neighbor and trying to say, well, President Tinubu as chairman has to himself show good example by obeying the rules of ECOWAS. The long-term issue is about how to reform ECOWAS. And I hope President Tinubu, while he's so busy with the crisis in Nigeria, food inflation, food insecurity, banditry, and all that, we take this along as one of the things that he has to look at as one of those areas in which leadership is required on his part.
Well, when the Niger coup happened in July of 2023, ECOWAS's response was very, very tough in terms of imposing sanctions and even saying that in the event that failed, they would move ahead to take on force and to approach it with force. And it seemed like ECOWAS was talking tough, despite calls from interested stakeholders, including Nigerian states that had shared borders with Niger, who had said that, in fact, some of them shared very close and cordial relationships, and some of their family members were from the other side of the divide in terms of Niger and vice versa. And perhaps Nigeria, as part of ECOWAS and being our president being the chairman, should rethink its stance on this. However, it didn't seem at that time like there was any going back on the decision. And this was said to have been so as to make a strong stance against the undemocratic nature of coups and the fact that it seemed like the Sahel region, especially the West African countries, were plagued by coups. And so as a deterrence, ECOWAS felt the need to come out strong against this. Unfortunately, it didn't seem like this was working, because rather than capitulate, Niger and the other countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, eventually said they were pulling out of ECOWAS. So they were almost like, up with yours. We don't need to be a part of the regional bloc. And that was, of course, something that might have precipitated this, going back in terms of the decision on the sanctions and coming really hard on these countries. There have been negotiations happening already with talks about keeping, these countries still in ECOWAS, saying that it was better to strengthen rather than divide the regional bloc. We don't know how much this decision would affect ECOWAS, those three countries, from saying, okay, we wouldn't, leave ECOWAS anymore. They have 1 year from the date on which they announced that they're going to be leaving or sending their letters to their decision to withdraw from ECOWAS. Beyond that, talking about the geopolitical slant to this, only on Tuesday, the United States Command for U.S. Africa Command, the commander for U.S. Africa Command, Michael Langley, held talks with a junta in Niger Republic. Again, there have been concerns around the attraction of Russia to Niger and some of these other countries that have been plagued by coups. And so in that instance, the United States would want to almost come in to enforce or to make itself attractive so as to prevent Niger and these countries from being in cohorts with Russia. So beyond the conversation of Niger and Russia is that bigger conversation around Russia and America and their influence on the African continent. So at the end of the day, one might wonder whether there was also an influence from the United States as to ECOWAS's decision to lift the sanctions, and of course Nigeria also being a part of ECOWAS, making that decision to to implement the decisions made on February 23rd. So a number of things to consider. But again, it then shows as to how relevant or how influential ECOWAS is in terms of its influence on member states. Like Dr. Abati had mentioned, if they've taken this decision, capitulated, then what's the deterrence for any other country who's planning a coup to go ahead and do that? Because it means that sanctions didn't work. The fact that they threatened to leave ECOWAS instead shook perhaps the regional bloc, and now they're coming to conversations which they ought to have had previously with these nations in terms of a softer way to deal with the matter rather than coming hard on them with sanctions. The big question then would be, what's the future of ECOWAS? How do they begin to regroup and be strengthened and not be exposed to external influence from the United States or even from Russia? Move on to other news this morning, and news making headlines this morning. The Central Bank of Nigeria yesterday announced the allocation of 2.15 million bags of fertilizer worth over 100 billion naira to the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security for disbursements to farmers to enhance agricultural production in the country. Access Holdings PLC, the holdco, has announced the return of Igboje Ig Imokwede as its non-executive chairman. The naira appreciated at the parallel market to 1,600 naira to a dollar. This comes after it had been hovering around 1,610 naira to 1,630 naira for the past 2 weeks. On the foreign scene, U.S. House passes bill that could ban TikTok nationwide as China says U.S. TikTok ban an act of bullying that would backfire. In the UK, Diane Abbott has accused Tories and Labour of failing to tackle racism, while Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says he won't return money from donor accused of racism. Now that's the news making the headlines this morning. Rufai, Dr. Abati, there's so many things, of course, a number of stories to touch on. I know some would come up later on during business and newspaper review, but your take on some of these stories?
I mean, if there's anyone you particularly would want me to take a stab on, I mean, I'm ready to take a stab on it, but there are lots of stories there. I mean, what else can you say? For instance, the state of the currency, we've been going back and forth as regards that now.
It's appreciated.
It's appreciated, that's good, but also you've gotten some deceleration and appreciation over time. It's just been hovering around the 1,500, 1,600 mark. Recently, it was reported in the news that we're about to go to the Eurobond market again. There's going to be some advice like Chapel Hill Denham to look into the possibility of that. One thing is obvious, that Nigeria does need money, and that money will be used fine, number one, to shore up the foreign reserve base. Number two, will also be used to be able to bolster our economy and, to be able to balance out the budget, this same budget that we've been talking about for a while, and all the shenanigans that have happened as regards this budget and all of that. So we are looking at that story. Also, I mean, the TikTok scenario is also still there. I mean, the US could pass that bill to ban TikTok, but there's been some people too that have balked as regards that bill. And we're looking at that story also very firmly. So, I mean, there are potpourri of stories out there. I'll just yield the floor.
Okay, I thought you mentioned something about the CBN.
Yes.
Giving fertilizers worth 100 billion naira to farmers through the Ministry of Agriculture to achieve price stability, and also giving money to the Ministry of Agriculture. I think that is a very big story, against the background of the fact that the CBN governor, in one famous speech, told us that the CBN under his watch is not going to engage in direct interventions, which was a veiled criticism of the kind of interventions that we had under Godwin Emefiele as CBN governor under the Anchor Borrowers program. And everyone jubilated that, under Cardoso, there will be no intervention either by way of Anchor Borrowers program, taking over fiscal functions beyond monetary function, or abuse of ways and means. It's not up to a month or so after he gave that assurance. The same CBN governor has now reached a point whereby he needs to give us clarifications. He needs to explain. How did he jump from saying, he won't do direct interventions, he will focus on monetary policy, and then the justification that he has given for this? He says, from not doing quasi-fiscal interventions, we will do certain monetary interventions that, to promote monetary policy in association with ministries, departments, and agencies. What kind of woolly, woolly talk is that? It's absolutely woolly. And that's why I think he needs to clarify it. If he says he's not going to do direct interventions, he should say so. Now, he says the idea is to manage food inflation. If indeed the CBN wants to manage food inflation to help government, that is the responsibility of government. It's not the responsibility of the CBN. The CBN can come up with structured intervention. And this is the point that we make. If you go to the UK, they have something called the Treasury. When the Bank of England wants to intervene in any way, it does so through the Treasury. But since the days of the military, we have had this situation whereby every CBN governor thinks that the money in the CBN belongs to him or belongs to the CBN, whereas the central bank is supposed to be bankers to the government. So it's true government, and if they can, they will get involved indirectly. The best that they can do is to offer guarantees, structured intervention through public-private sector. Now we're told the CBN is going to give fertilizers worth $100 billion and also give money. So what is Cardoso CBN going to give next? Maize? Are we going to now have a CBN that will also be distributing millet, that will be distributing cassava? And now what exactly is the difference between what Cardoso was criticizing as direct interventions by Emefiele? As far as I'm concerned, is the same thing. So I expect that Cardoso CBN will offer us an explanation. And then going through the Ministry of Agriculture. Which Ministry of Agriculture? Ministry of Agriculture. When, before Additional was made the Minister of Agriculture, that's Akinwumi Additional, who is now with the AFDB, there was a fertilizer scam in that ministry because we had the same kind of situation that Cardoso's CBN wants to get into. Because Ministry of Agriculture had collected money from CBN, they said they were distributing fertilizer. The civil servants turned it into an opportunity for self-enrichment. The first thing Additional did when he got there was to stop that fertilizer scam. He went directly to the farmers. And that was when he came up with the idea of the e-wallet. E-wallet, it was called at that time. So please, the first lesson Olayemi Cardoso should learn as CBN governor is that he has to give us clarity about policy interventions. And he has to be consistent. He cannot say he's not going to intervene directly today, and then tomorrow he's hiding intervention under monetary policy and food inflation. I'm confused. That's why I'm asking for clarity, clarification, and explanations. Monetary policy, price stability. The CBN should stay within his functional zone and not criticize Emefiele and then do the same thing that they are criticizing Emefiele for. They will be vindicating what they are criticizing. Simple. That is my point.
Simple. Well, and where are the role of the agric banks?
Yes, well,
that's the question we should be asking.
We had mentioned you would go to the Ministry of Agriculture at this point, and like you mentioned, so many questions to be responded to. But I believe that this government is just trying, moving away, policy direction this way, capitulate, move to another direction. But we need, like you mentioned, a certain and definite policy direction.